I'd like to invite our next speaker. I'll introduce Andrej in Ukrainian. So, Andrej, I hope I'll pronounce your name correctly. Bukovac-Mimica. Andrej Bukovac-Mimica. Він є докторантом Гельсінського університету і також викладає історію церкви в Центрі протестантської теології Matthiasa Flaciusa Illyricського університету у Загребі. І він поділиться з нами оглядом досвіду югославських, ну, якщо ми можемо вживати такий термін, так, мешканців колишньої Югославії під час тоталітарного минулого у цій країні. So, Andrej, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I'm just going to share the screen. Well, thank you. I think Roman introduced me already. I'm not sure if you mentioned that my research is focused on the relationship between the churches and the state. It's very much in the beginning phases at the moment. But I do have some insight that I can provide you. So I was thinking of starting with some background on Protestantism on the territory of Yugoslavia. So originally it started appearing on this territory already in the middle of the 16th century. Most of the lands that would later become Yugoslavia were then either under Ottoman rule or were part of the so-called military frontier. So this was basically a buffer zone between the Ottoman Empire and the Habsburg lands. So there was very little opportunity in such circumstances for any sort of religious movement to thrive because the land was desolated and people were basically struggling just to live. So, but nevertheless, a few hotspots of Protestantism did emerge even in this early period. Most notably in Metlika, that would be today in a town in today's Slovenia. These images displayed on the PowerPoint, these are parts 1 and 2 of the oldest preserved translation of the New Testament in Croatian. There is an older Gallic translation, although it has never been found. It is only mentioned in historical sources and sporadically. It is interesting that this oldest translation was produced by a group of Protestants in a town of Urach in Germany. They actually founded a printing house. It operated between 1561 and 1565. Apart from this translation of the New Testament, they produced several other religious books. I think Theophil mentioned that there was also some publishing activity Protestant in Romania in this period. These books were the territory of Croatia or the Yugoslavia at this time was Catholic. So these books were literally illegal to possess and to distribute, right? And they had an entire network of people who were involved in transport and distribution of these books. And they essentially formed an illegal underground organization that distributed these illegal books. So it was kind of like a Protestant mafia, really. It's an interesting story. Anyway, despite these efforts, Protestantism never really took root in the 16th century in Croatia. So it was basically uprooted by the efforts of the Counter-Reformation, particularly Franciscans and the Jesuits. So it only appeared again in the late 18th century when immigrants from Slovak and German immigrants started arriving on the territory. It started developing more seriously after 1859. I think I should have changed the slide. Okay. So this is a so-called Protestant patent of 1859 issued by Franz Joseph of Austria. So this is a piece of legislation that allowed religious freedoms to Lutherans and Calvinists, so-called Calvinists. This is the Reformed churches. in Austria-Hungary. So this is sort of from this time onward, Protestantism really started to develop more quickly in the territory. In that same year, in 1859, the first evangelical church was founded in Zagreb, in Croatia. During the later 19th century, other Protestant, this was predominantly, so these Protestant communities were ethnically predominantly Hungarian, Slovak, and German. Slovaks and Germans were mostly evangelical, while Hungarians were mostly Reformed. During the late 19th century, evangelical churches among the Croatian, the local population, I mean the ethnically Croatian population also, and Slovenian population started also to appearing. And also during the late 19th century, there were the first so-called the free churches. Among the first were the Baptists and the Nazarenes. This immigration of Protestants was opposed by the Catholic bishops. Generally speaking, in these territories, minority religions were often marginalized in society. There was like we might say, the mutual mistrust between these Protestant communities and the wider populations. The reasons for this are many, but probably most starkly was this strong affiliation between the national identity and the religious identity. That is something we see in a lot of places. Okay, so we come to the period between the world wars. So after World War I, Austria and Hungary was disbanded, and then consecutive states emerged after that. The Yugoslav Evangelical Church was founded in 1924. It was officially recognized by the government of the Kingdom of Yugoslavia in 1930. Alongside it, so these are the list contains the religious communities, Protestant religious communities that were officially recognized. So the German Evangelical Church, the Slovak, and the Reformed Evangelical Church. These numbers, I can't confirm these numbers. These numbers vary greatly depending on sources, so please take them with a grain of salt. I can't guarantee how accurate they are. They vary by a factor of 50,000 members. So I can't really guarantee on the accuracy of the numbers. But there were significant numbers of Protestants during this period. So apart from these officially recognized churches, there was also a number of other smaller unrecognized Christian communities, such as the Baptist Union, which the Baptists, as we said, they appeared already in the late 19th century. The Baptist Union was founded in 1923, although it wasn't recognized as a religious community. It was like an association of the citizens association. Also the Adventist Church, which also started to appear in the late 19th century, and the Pentecostal Church, Methodist Church, and a number of other smaller free churches. Most of these communities, almost all, I think all of them, more or less all of them, will continue to exist in the Socialist Yugoslavia after World War II. In the interwar period, the Evangelical Church was the third largest church in Yugoslavia after the Catholic and Orthodox churches, the Catholic Church and the Serbian Orthodox Church. A bit about the Evangelical Church in Croatia. It's kind of the focus of the presentation. I didn't really make it systematic like Theophil. I'm kind of more narrative. Anyway, so as we said, Evangelical Church in this period was largely composed of German population. So in 1939, as we said, around 110,000 members. Out of 8,000 were ethnic Germans, as it says. The church, in a way, saw itself as the bearer of German national identity. It's sort of, so it says like the representative of the German minority in in Yugoslavia. The most prominent figure, the most prominent figure was Bishop Philip Pope. He was the bishop of the Evangelical Church. He was also, from 1940 onwards, the representative of the German minority in the Croatian parliament, actually. So here are some things that will be important later on for the fate of the Evangelical Church in the early years after World War II. So during the 1930s, Germans in Yugoslavia were under the influence of the nationalism that was growing in the Weimar Republic. This led to some tensions between the German and the Slovakian Evangelical Church. Of course, there were also some propaganda claims, propaganda slogans, such as that the Germans are the standard bearers of culture amongst the Slavs. Regarding its ecumenical relations during that time, it's interesting because they maintained very good relations with the Serbian Orthodox Church, but were very cold toward the Catholic Church. They had a sort of a common political goal with the Orthodox Church, because they were opposing together the concordat that was being negotiated between the Kingdom of Yugoslavia and the Holy See since 1932. Then in 1937 the idea was abandoned. Bishop Pope was a staunch supporter of the German awakening of the 1930s. And most strikingly, in 1934, he signed a friendship agreement with Bishop Ludwig Mila, that was the leader of the German Christians. We need to note just that the Hitler's overtaking of power was generally not viewed favorably amongst Yugoslav Protestants. They were mostly skeptical towards the Nazi regime. So Pope was somewhat isolated in this in his sympathies towards the Nazi regime. However, this friendship awarded the Evangelical Church significant material aid from Germany. Now we get to World War II. The Kingdom of Yugoslavia fell apart in 1941 after a coup and was shortly thereafter invaded by Nazi Germany. And then it was divided into various puppet states and occupational zones. Again, mostly occupational zones, one puppet state, the independent states of Croatia. That's this thing in the middle. This political entity was, of course, not an independent state. It was a puppet regime. It existed until the end of the Second World War. During this period, the German population was in a favorable position. It had equal political rights as the Croatian population. Evangelical Church maintained very close ties with the government. And it became the third recognized religious community alongside the Catholic Church and the Muslim community. We should also note here that the Catholic Church also greeted the establishment of the independent state of Croatia, which would also later have a large impact on the events immediately following the Second World War. So one example, the religious officials in the independent state of Croatia had to take an oath of allegiance to the regime, and also had to provide a statement of race or a statement of racial belonging. I'm not sure how exactly what the English term is. So these are some examples. There were free-form ones to the left, or these predetermined forms that you just fill out. This is basically a list of whether this asks whether your parents, grandparents, or matricular person you're married to have a non-Aryan predecessors. Right. So as we can see, this was a policy that was this state had a policy that was very, very close to the actual racial policy of Nazi Germany. There were, of course, prosecutions of Jewish population, Roman population. Unlike Germany, the independent state added also the Serbian population to their list. And it is also claimed that Bishop Pope and others in the evangelical church knew about these, because this was a regime that operated literal extermination camps. They didn't have gas chambers and crematoria. They used knives and threw bodies into ditches, but these were extermination camps in the full sense of the term. And no one in the evangelical church spoke out ever about these things. I mean, during the period. Okay, so this is after World War II. So during 1944, the Wehrmacht and its allies were retreating, and the war was coming to an end. So until middle 1945, the occupation of Yugoslavia was over, and the communist regime was effectively in power. Now, what followed was a string of extrajudicial killings, executions, court-martials that ended with swift executions. These were reprisals for either perceived or real collaboration with the authorities of the previous regime. Religious officials were by no means spared in these events. So this was a typical charge in trials of religious officials during the last final year of the war and immediately following, was the charge of collaboration with the enemy. So this was something that that was very often encountered. So this is basically what happened to Bishop Pope. He remained in Zagreb after the war, and on 24th of May 1945 he was arrested. He was convicted for collaboration with the enemy, and he was executed on 30th of June. 57 others were charged in the same judicial process, including the Zagreb Mufti, Ismet Muftic, and a person named Gregory Maximov, who was the leader of the Croatian Orthodox Church. Now, I suspect that some of you, or maybe all of you, have never heard about a Croatian Orthodox Church. So, just a note on this organization. So, this was a church that was founded in 1942 by the regime of the independent state of Croatia. The idea behind it was to compel the Orthodox Serbian population to leave the Serbian Orthodox Church and join the Croatian one. They make a claim on the organization has been revitalized in 2010, interestingly, but it is not a church, it's not a recognized religious organization. It is basically a far-right group today. They claim on their website that they received at some point approval from the ecumenical patriarch, but I'm not sure if that is true. Most probably isn't. So, okay, to get back to the evangelical church. Oh, sorry. Okay. Okay. So the already in 1944, the regime of the communist regime of this nascent Yugoslavia issued a declaration on the basic rights of people and citizens of democratic Croatia. Okay, that was the Croatian regime, but yeah, it was part of this communist alliance. Anyway, this declaration guaranteed right to private property. However, German population was exempt from this rights to holding property. So this was effectively a collective charge of collaboration that was directed against the German people. So this confiscation was announced in 1944 and was implemented in 1945. And this included the property of the evangelical church, because the evangelical church was seen by the regime as a purely German organization. And all of its property, literally all of it, was confiscated immediately, and all the churches were immediately closed. This was in 1945. However, these confiscations were rarely permanent. Most communities were granted the right to use buildings, or the buildings were returned to them in most of the cases, as long as there still was a community. Because the majority of the German population fled to Germany during 1944, 1945, and the following years. I also ran across a number, ran across an estimate that this was around 460,000 people. That sounds like a large number, although it is possible. And in 1948, the state issued amendments to the law on citizenship that explicitly forbade the return of the German population. So almost all of the evangelical pastors had fled. The bishop was executed. All of the property was confiscated. So the evangelical community immediately after World War II basically ceased to exist. It very soon recovered because very soon the buildings were returned slowly. It was curious that this is the building of the evangelical church in Zagreb. The actual church is to the left. The building to the right is like the administrative building that also housed the evangelical school. Curiously, the building on the right has been confiscated. However, the building on the left, the actual church building, was never confiscated because a member of the Commission on Confiscations was also a member of the evangelical community. So he discreetly allowed the confiscation order to be lost amongst the paperwork. So the confiscation order never went through. Okay, so this is Edgar Pope. This is the son of Bishop Pope. This is a picture from his older years. I couldn't find a one where he was younger. Anyway, he served as an evangelical military chaplain. In 1945, he was arrested and sent to a POW camp, prisoner of war camp, and he spent several months there and finally was released in 1946. He was elected as a pastor of the evangelical community in Zagreb, and he would revitalize the life of the community. An important note here is that from 1946 onward, the services were held in Croatian as opposed to German. That was previously the case. So, as I said, after this initial wave of confiscations, the church buildings were successively returned. Also, I think Theophil mentioned this was also valid for Yugoslavia, that there was no systematic destruction of sacral objects, of buildings. Also, church buildings remained property of religious communities. That is also a difference between the Yugoslav model and the Soviet model, in which all of the buildings were confiscated and then they were rented basically, or allowed. Communities were allowed to use them. Also, here one thing that I should have probably mentioned earlier, that in Yugoslavia, religious communities had a legal personality. So, right. So those are some differences between the Soviet Union and the Yugoslav model. Other confiscations of property. Right. So the confiscations of for 1945 and 1946 were mostly due to the fact that evangelical church buildings were considered German property. So this thing, at least nominally, had very little to do with the fact that these were religious buildings. This was basically reprisal for World War II and the role of Germans in World War II. That was kind of the initial relationship. Other confiscations of property were due to legislation of nationalization and expropriation and the agrarian reform. So this was, I didn't really go into detail of these laws here. They have to do with the size of land holdings. So I think the land holdings above 10 acres were confiscated. But mostly affected by this was the Catholic Church because I think it was the largest landholder in Yugoslavia at the time. Again, this is not strictly related to religion and the fact that these were holdings of religious communities, but it was covered, it was at least nominally within the bounds of other legislation. Okay, so the Evangelical Church, after this initial years, the Evangelical Church managed to get back its building. Actually, half of its building, the other half was used as a high school. It was officially constituted as a synod in 1951. The church's statute was largely based on the 1930 statute of the German Evangelical Church. So it kept the presbyterial structure. And Edgar Popp was elected as senior of the church. Okay, to get back to the previous image. So the center of this evangelical church was in Zagreb, where already before World War II there was a large portion of non-German members. Now, due to the exodus of the German populations, the Zagreb community lost around half of its members. So in 1946, it had around 1,500. A larger evangelical community existed in the town of Legrad on the Hungarian border. It had around 14,000 members in 1948. Then later, it was around 8,000 because of further immigration of Germans. The evangelical churches in Bosnia and the evangelical communities in Vojvodina and Serbia were placed under the jurisdiction under the Zagreb Signorat in 1943 and 1944. So since 1944, the church bore the somewhat cumbersome title of the Evangelical Church in the People's Republic of Croatia, Bosnia and Herzegovina, and the autonomous province of Vojvodina. Anyway, after this initial chaotic period following World War II, the early 50s were basically marked by a consolidation of the Evangelical Church and a period of an uptick in religious life. In the same year that the Evangelical Church was founded, the bishop of the Reformed Church, Shandra Agoston, made a comment that the commissions for relations with religious communities, that was the government organ that was in charge of basically interceding between the state and the religious communities, a point of contact. He made a comment that they were full of understanding and benevolent. Other similar comments came from other religious institutions. So this is a question of whether this was propaganda. I mean, not propaganda, but that these comments were said basically under duress or not. That is one of the things that I am trying to find out through my research. So in about 4 years, I will be able to tell you more about this. Yes, anyway, so this is interesting when we compare it with the concurrent situation in the early 50s of the Catholic Church. So this was the period when the relations reached an all-time low. On 17th of December 1952, the Assistant Minister of External Affairs gave a letter to the Apostolic Nuncio, which stated that that further diplomatic relations were unnecessary between Yugoslavia and the Holy See, right? So there's a stark difference between the position of the Catholic Church with respect to the regime and other religious communities. Evangelical churches weren't the exception in this rule. The Muslim community, the Jewish community, other were also at least from the outside nominally developed a cooperative religion with the Yugoslav authorities. Why the Catholic relationship was pretty bitter? This was due to a number of reasons, which kind of go outside the scope of this presentation. But just to like make a few comments, this conflict was more political in nature. The conflict was happening at the levels of high diplomacy between the apostolic nuncio and bishops and the government. However, on the terrain, on the actual parish level, communities were often harassed in like minor ways, in administrative ways. So, such as, for example, they were denied permits for church denied permits to restore church buildings. They were denied permits to buy paper for religious dress, and there were cases of beatings, there were cases of arrests, there were cases of obstruction of liturgy, but these were cases. These were incidents. This wasn't government policy. This wasn't something that was systematically done. This was something that was done on the local level by individuals. Okay, slide 13. Right. Okay. So one other thing that maybe is important to mention, development. This is the 1953 legislation on the legal status of religious communities. I've listed here some of the more notable provisions. It covers many other provisions. Most of these provisions covered in the law were already established in other legislation as well as the 1946 Constitution. So what this legislation did was basically to compile and clarify the various legal issues that appeared. This law would later be amended on, I think, 2 or 3 occasions, but it would largely remain as it is in effect until the end of Yugoslavia. So now some general points regarding religious communities in general in Yugoslavia. So we might say that the position for some religious communities was more equal when compared to the interwar period. So this particularly applies to the so-called sects. When I say sects, this was literally a provision in legislation of the Kingdom of Yugoslavia. For example, the Adventist community was considered a sect, which was basically unwelcomed. However, in later Yugoslavia, the Adventist community expanded greatly. So by 1980, there were around 300 Adventist congregations in Yugoslavia with around 11,000 members. In the late 60s, they even founded a high school in the town of Milošević, and in 1978, at the same place, they founded an Adventist theological faculty. So so the fact that religion was relegated to the private sphere under the communist regime was already the way of life of most Protestant communities. So we might say that their position hasn't really changed dramatically when compared to earlier times. Protestant communities in Yugoslavia, they often existed in sort of ghettos. This is ghettos, and not in a pejorative sense, but like in a metaphorical sense. They often relied on financial aid from their members, as well as foreign organizations. Cooperation between denominations was sporadic and occasional, often. These communities were often not very active socially or politically. This prolonged period of Ghettoization led to a self-understanding of churches as the chosen people. So this was an impediment to ecumenical cooperation. Some sort of legacy of this sort of stance can still be seen in some religious communities today, Protestant churches today in Croatia. However, there were notable exceptions to this trend, of course. This was primarily the Baptist Union of the Baptist Union of Yugoslavia is probably the standard bearer for another approach. So, for example, a theologian Baptist theologian named Bratko Polovrec, he started, this is also a picture of him old, I couldn't find one where he was younger. In the 1960s, he started to produce and publish ecumenical Christian literature under the publishing house called the Duhovna Stvarnost, means spiritual reality. Also, the Baptist Union in 1967 organized a visit by the aforementioned Billy Graham to Zagreb. That's why I was interested in what Theophil was commenting about him. They organized a preaching event for 7 consecutive days in a Catholic parish in Zagreb. What is interesting, this event was broadcasted by several European TV stations, so this was a very public event. Generally, the 60s and early 70s, late 60s, early 70s in Yugoslavia, they were a period kind of a religious renewal. This is partly due to the Second Vatican Council, which also sparked a renewed negotiation between the Catholic Church and the state. As we remembered, in 1952, they broke diplomatic relationships with the Holy See. So in the early 60s, they started to rebuild these relationships. So there was kind of a general opening towards religion, let's say, in Yugoslavia. Also, these two people are, this is Josip Horák and Vladimir Dojic. Josip Horák was the president of the Baptist Union in Croatia, the Union of Yugoslavia, I'm sorry. He was named the president in 1957. He's most probably the most prominent Baptist leader in Yugoslavia. He maintained close ties with the World Baptist Assembly, and he was named vice president of the World Baptist Assembly in 1985. What is more interesting, so together with Vladimir Dojic, who was senior of the Evangelical Church, in 1975, they founded the theological faculty Matthias, Flacius, Illyricus. That's the institution where I work today. Although today it is called the University Center for Protestant Theology. This was a joint effort between the Evangelical Church and the Baptist Union. The faculty was at the time, as it is today, it has been, it's not a confessionally determined institution. So it's an institution that is open to all confessions, all people, regardless of religious affiliation. It conducted a 5-year program in theology. In 1977, the faculty organized an international ecumenical symposium entitled "The Role of the Church in the Contemporary World," and it had over 160 attended by over 160 participants from several countries. Yeah, it's a sort of a comical note that this endeavor was viewed by the by the bishop of the Slovak Evangelical Church. This he viewed it as a sort of a personal crusade of Horák and Deutsch, and was kind of kind of angry they didn't involve him in it, basically. Yeah, there were kind of tensions between these communities. There always have been. There is an article published. It's called "Two Protestants, Three Churches." It's actually in English, so it kind of addresses this sort of discord that is like present amongst Protestant communities, where it talks about this tendency of like ghettoization, where they view their own community as the chosen people, and everyone else, including the other Protestants, as the world. Okay, so this is basically the end of my presentation. I was hoping to, if anyone has some questions, I'd be glad to further explain.
Thank you, and Andrej. Well, I'll ask first question, and maybe then we'll have a few more minutes for a few more questions, because then we have a break. So my question is, what was the reason that still, you mentioned it a few times, that still religious politic of Yugoslavian government was not that harsh and strict and anti-religious as it was in Soviet Union, where actually the atheism was proclaimed as a goal, and there was a very strong anti-religious propaganda, and actually the destruction of temples, of churches, and the destruction of church unions, associations. What was the reason that Yugoslavian regime was not that harsh against churches, specifically evangelicals?
Well, generally speaking, the Yugoslav communism, Yugoslav regime was much less repressive than the Soviet regime. So in all facets. So all of these elements existed. There was also the secret police that was spying on people. There were also people who were prosecuted due to their political stances. Atheism was the official ideology of the state, and there was an anti-church propaganda. There were all of these elements that existed also in the Soviet Union, but they were much less strict, much less harsh. Regarding some like real differences, for example, a factual, like real tangible differences, for example, the fact that churches in the Yugoslavia had legal personality, right? Whereas in the Soviet Union they didn't have. That's like one tangible, describable difference. But all of these other differences were just that the entire regime was less strict. It wasn't just towards the evangelical church; it was towards all religious communities. The rule, in short, was if you kept quiet, then you were okay. If you spoke against the regime, then they will make problems for you. So that is basically what happened with the Catholic Church. But still, it wasn't that seriously prosecuted. It was okay. First period after World War II, that was basically reprisal for what happened during the war, reprisal for the independent state of Croatia. So that it was the initiation of the relationship, and this kind of it started with prosecutions and confiscations of property. Then the church reacted with accusations against the government. Then the government acted with more reprisals. Then the church reacted, and it was just like this self-perpetuating toxic relationship that grew worse and worse and worse, and culminated in 1952. So, but by the early 1960s, this relationship also started this tension started to simmer down, and the relationship was kind of normalizing. But like in short, as long as the community, so this wasn't only regarding religious communities, this regards all associations, all communities, all people. As long as you remained politically in line, you were free basically to do what you want. That is
yeah. Okay.
That is kind of
yeah. Thank you. Okay, friends, we actually need some break. So I'd like to take liberty as a moderator of this webinar to say thank you to Theophil and Andrej for your really presentations. They were illuminating. I wasn't aware about many aspects of religious politic in, so to say, Soviet communist time in Romania and Croatia. Thank you for your presentations. I would like to encourage you to put it on paper and publish. Everything that you prepared should be published at this or that form, and you did a good work, so I believe it should be kind of presented. So Andrej was very modest when he said that he's just on initial stages of his research, because you spoke, as a real historian. I have my first PhD in history, so I can evaluate how deep you are into this, into
Thank
archive
you.
work and all historical details. So I would like to thank you also for your work.